Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today and to share a little bit of my work with you. After we've heard yesterday a lot already about therapy, I'm trying to catch up with the basics today a little bit and talk about characterization, distinction, and dosing of LSD. So maybe take a look at this slide, and here I put on all the modern studies that have been conducted with LSD. And this is still not a lot, since they all fit on one page, more or less. And what you can see here is that there seems to be a high interest in microdosing, but also that we in Switzerland are in a very unique position regarding the research with LSD, as well as in phase 2 studies, as also the possibility to conduct phase 1 studies in healthy volunteers. And this brings me to the next slide, which is the importance of phase 1 research. Why are we even conducting studies in healthy volunteers? So first, there is increasing interest in new approaches in psychiatry, of course, and usually before substances enter the patient in phase 2, basic information needs to be obtained on dosing, characterization, and also on pharmacokinetics. Additionally, there has been for a very long time no really good scientifically defined dose-effect relationship for LSD. And this is really important since, as I already said, or as we already heard a lot, the first data in depression, anxiety, and addiction disorders look very promising. So this is an overview on the questions I'm trying to answer today with different studies we conducted in Basel. First of all, are psychedelics different from entactogens and stimulants? And I think this question is important to answer because MDMA is also often taken together with all the psychedelics. What dose should I use? What is the difference between LSD and psilocybin? And another last question is, do antidepressants interact with psilocybin? So as said, I'm trying to catch up with the basics a little bit today. So let's take a look on how LSD is characterized again. So it's a classic psychedelic, and this is characterized via agonism on 5-HT2A receptors. LSD is used illicitly for recreational purposes, but also as adjunct to psychotherapy, but also for more somatic diseases such as cluster headaches. It has a very low toxicity, but the risks lie more in the possibility of psychological disturbances. Its effects include the realization of time and space, increased visual, acoustic, and emotional perception, as well as a moderate cardiovascular stimulation. So on the right side, I put the scaffold of LSD, as well as that of serotonin, and the one marked in green is the scaffold both share, which already gives us a hint a little bit that they may have the same binding site or share one binding site, which would be the 5-HT2A receptor. So as you did see in my introductions, what are further study drugs I'm talking about today? It's first psilocybin, which is also a classic psychedelic and also binds directly to 5-HT2A receptors. Then we have MDMA, which is a prototypical entactogen. It does not have a direct mechanism of action, but an indirect one by releasing serotonin and mainly norepinephrine. Then we have the amphetamine, which also has an indirect mechanism of action by interacting with dopamine and norepinephrine systems. And we have as antidepressant Escitalopram, which inhibits the serotonin transporter and has therefore also more indirect mechanism of action. All of these substances are somehow therapeutically used. So all the studies I'm talking about today are phase 1 studies in healthy volunteers. And for all studies, we used a double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover design with 2 to 6 study days in standard hospital rooms. Study days lasted between 6 and 24 hours, depending on the doses we were administering. And the most important inclusion and exclusion criteria were no acute somatic condition, no acute or previous psychiatric condition, no psychotic disorders in first-degree relatives, a limited previous drug use, and a normal body weight. So, and I also want to emphasize this. We use a LSD formulation for all our studies that is pharmaceutically well defined. And we use an oral formulation that has a confirmed stability. And this is important because we know from our own lab that previous studies have not had a very stable formulation. However, we did only see that afterwards, after we had this new formulation. And also something I want to emphasize is we are working with LSD base. And let's say the street LSD you can get is usually LSD tartrate. And it has a ratio. And the ratio is, the most common one is like the base tartrate ratio is 1:1, which means that 100 micrograms of LSD base are equivalent to approximately 146 microgram of LSD tartrate, which means when I talk about 100 microgram of LSD, it might be 150 micrograms street LSD. So, and also, I wanted to show how we assess subjective effects, and I'm only talking today about 2 main tools we use. One are visual and analog scales, and you can see it's a very simple tool. These are 10 centimeter long lines. We ask them, how do you feel? Give them a sheet of paper, and there are questions like, do you feel anything? Is it good? Is it bad? And they can just mark on a line from not at all to extreme. And the second one, I'm sure you're all familiar with, is the 5 dimensions of altered state of consciousness. It also consists of 94 visual analog scales. So let's start with the first study, the distinction of LSD, MDMA, and amphetamine. We used these 3 prototypical substances, as well as try to find prototypical doses. We used 100 microgram of LSD, which is considered a moderate dose, 125 milligram of MDMA, which is considered a high dose, and 40 milligrams of amphetamine, which is also considered a high dose. So let's first take a look at the vital signs they induce. And on the first panel, you can see in green that amphetamine increases systolic blood pressure much more than MDMA in red and LSD in purple. However, when you look at the panel right below it, you can see a little bit a different picture, which shows that LSD increases heart rate much more than MDMA and amphetamine. However, there's a tool to combine these two. It's called the rate pressure product. You combine systolic blood pressure with heart rate to find something to show how the cardiovascular stimulation is. And when you compare 3 substances, they show a comparable cardiovascular stimulation. And all 3 substances increased body temperature similarly. So, as we have seen, they all have a similar cardiovascular stimulation. However, the subjective effects look a little different. In the first panel, you can already see that the anti-drug effect is much more increased by LSD in comparison to MDMA and amphetamine, even though we used a moderate dose of LSD in comparison to the other 2. We see the same picture for good drug effects, and for unspecific bad drug effects, we see that they are only induced by LSD. So here we would have a first distinction between the entactogens, stimulants, and psychedelics. On the next panel, you see concentration. It's what we would expect. LSD decreases concentration, whereas amphetamine increases it. Same for talkative. And then on the last panel, you can see the ego dissolution. And you can see that this seems to be something that is typical for psychedelics, because LSD increases it a lot in comparison to the other two. So, and then on the 5-dimension of altered states of consciousness, and purple again LSD, we see that LSD induces complex alterations of consciousness in comparison to the other two, and that MDMA, for example, when directly compared to LSD, only induces a blissful state. So, since we have now distinguished psychedelics from the other prototypical substances, let's take a look at the LSD dose response. Let's start here with the subjective effects. We see on the first panel that we have a dose-dependent increase for any drug effects up to a dose of 100 micrograms. When we double the dose up to 200 micrograms, we do not see an increase anymore in effect strength, more or less. The same we see for good drug effect. However, for bad drug effect, we can still see an increase with higher doses. The same for fear. The sense of time is also diminished dose-dependently. Then on the last panel, again, the ego dissolution, we see that the higher the dose gets, the more it increases. So this seems to be more the classical psychedelic-like effect, which we can induce by giving high doses. For the alterations in state of consciousness, this time a little bit in a different visualization, so that we can see the dose dependency better. And so what we see here, it's dose dependent with a ceiling effect, again, at 100 micrograms. The only thing that further goes up are the disembodiment and the anxious ego dissolution total score. For the rest, we do not see statistically significant differences for 100 and 200 micrograms, even though there is a nominal differences. So, and for the vital signs, they all increase dose-dependently: systolic blood pressure, heart rate, diastolic blood pressure, as well as body temperature. So, and this is something we also do, is that we always measure plasma concentrations of these substances in the body to see how they react, whether there is a linear plasma concentration relationship, and we can see this on the first panel really nicely for LSD, that when we double the doses, the plasma concentration double as well. And so I put the any-drug effect next to it again, where even though the plasma concentration doubles, we don't see a doubling in effects. These figures here have been made with a technique called PK-PD modeling. It means we link the effects to the plasma concentrations. And when you do this, you can interpolate many effect points, more or less. And so we can also calculate effect durations. And I want to emphasize two things here. On the first row, the onset starts the earlier, the higher the dose is, and the effect duration is the longer, the higher the dose gets. So something we would expect. So, and I will lose some small words on microdosing as well. This was a study that was conducted at the University of Maastricht in a collaboration with us. And I'm only going to show you this slide here. And in the bolder lines, you can see the plasma concentrations again. which also double nicely with doubling doses. And in the thinner lines, you can see the corresponding effect curves. And you can also nicely see that plasma concentrations peaks before effect, which means that something happens in the body before the effects start, probably activation of the receptors. And what we can also see is for the lowest dose, 5 microgram, we see not really a perceptual effect. For 10 micrograms, it's a little bit on the act of perception. However, with 20 micrograms, we already see a considerable effect. That's why we also thought that try to make a definition out of this, that doses below 10 micrograms can be called microdoses, and doses higher than 10 micrograms should rather be called mini doses because they do have a perceptual effect. So, and then I will move forward to the LSD psilocybin comparison study. This study has not yet been published. So what we did was we gave 100 and 200 microgram of LSD and tried to make a dose comparison or a dose equivalence. For this, we gave 15 milligram of psilocybin and 30 milligram of psilocybin. And let's start with the any-drug effect you're already familiar with. We can see that we already have the ceiling effect again for 100 and 200 micrograms of LSD, and 30 milligram of psilocybin a little bit goes with them. However, 15 milligram of psilocybin is weaker. We can see the almost identical for the good drug effect. 200 microgram goes a little bit higher, however, no statistical significance. For the bad drug, looks a little chaotic, but we see this 15 milligram psilocybin. It uses only weak, unspecific bad drug effects compared with the other doses and LSD. And for the ego dissolution, which I already think again that's it's really nice. We see a weak ego dissolution induced by 15 milligram of psilocybin, and then we see again a higher ego dissolution of 200 micrograms compared with 100 micrograms, and we have the 30 milligrams of psilocybin somewhere in between. And what you can also see really nicely at the any-drug effect, that psilocybin acts much shorter than LSD does. So for the 5 dimensions of altered states of consciousness, we see more or less the same as we did for the subjective effects. 30 milligrams of psilocybin, LSD 100 and 200 micrograms of LSD more or less go together, and 15 milligrams of psilocybin is much weaker. And let's take a look at the autonomic effects, which I think is really interesting because I took here the mean arterial pressure, which takes together the systolic and diastolic blood pressure, and we see that the high dose of psilocybin makes a large increase in blood pressure. However, on the panel right next to it, we see that LSD increases heart rate much more, and then when we take them together again, kind of as we did with the MDMA, we see a similar cardiovascular stimulation. However, the 15 milligrams is already much lower. But then, interestingly, the high dose of psilocybin increases body temperature a lot in comparison to the other two. So this is not something you're supposed to read because I know it's very small. I just wanted to show you that we also try to affect adverse effects. So, but what do adverse effects mean? I think we already discussed this yesterday. Sometimes they're just typical effects induced by these substances and not adverse effects, such as lack of concentration or maybe inner tension. However, what we see a lot but for both substances is in the evening or headaches. Well, it has been described previously, and it seems to be typical that after a day of exhaustion, maybe a headache turns up. And then what I also thought is really interesting, we ask the participants always after the session and after the study again, what did you think you got? Because it's double-blinded, and so the placebo was mostly correctly identified, and then we have the highest correct identification for psilocybin, for 15 milligram psilocybin, but then 30 milligram of psilocybin, 100 microgram of LSD, and 200 microgram of LSD is just completely mixed up. So even though they act much, or psilocybin acts much shorter, we don't see at the end of the study that people can differ between both substances. So, and together with this data, we tried to make a chart for dose equivalence, and we would say that 100 microgram of LSD would be probably equivalent to approximately 20 milligram of psilocybin, the 30 milligram of psilocybin equivalent to approximately 150 microgram of LSD. So the equivalence would be 1 to 200. So, and then this is a study which might be really interesting, because I think a question was asked to Peter Earn yesterday as well, whether he tapers off the SSRIs or the antidepressants before giving LSD. And we conducted a study where healthy participants were pre-treated 2 weeks with Escitalopram. So in the first week, they got 10 milligram of Escitalopram, and in the second week, 20 milligrams of Escitalopram. And on the last day, on the last day, they received 25 milligram of psilocybin. So 2 weeks is not that long for an antidepressant to take, and we more looked whether it's toxicological difficult to mix these two up, or whether it's dangerous. So, and what we see is that we have identical good drug effects induced with the placebo condition as well as with the SSRI condition. However, the SSRI reduces the bad drug effects and also reduces the fear. For the cardiostimulant effects, we see that it reduces a little bit the cardiovascular effects. However, this is something we would expect because this is known for SSRIs to do. And then on the alterations of mind, we have the identical good drug effects or the identical alterations of mind. However, it dampens a little bit the anxious ego dissolution as well as the anxiety, so the same more or less we did see on visual analog scales. So this does not mean that if someone takes over years a SSRI, that you can give psilocybin and have the same therapeutic effect, but it shows that it's not toxic to combine them. So, and I'm realizing I'm coming to the end of my talk, showing you an outlook on what will happen in our research group in the next 2 to 3 years in terms of phase 2 studies. So at the end of this year, the LSD assist study in anxiety patients conducted by Peter Gasser will come to an end. I'm working with him there to try to take care a little bit of the regulatory processes. And also 2 other studies we're conducting will come to an end in the next 2 to 3 years, which is LSD in depression, as well as LSD in the treatment of cluster headaches. So with this, I come to an end. This is our research group. It has grown a lot in the last few years, and thank you very much for your attention.
All right, so we have 15 minutes for questions. So any questions?
Yeah, I have a question over here. Thank you. It was very, very interesting, very informative. Did you say, and perhaps I didn't hear, were these experienced users? I asked the question because I was surprised, if they were experienced, that they couldn't tell the difference between LSD and psilocybin.
So some of them were experienced, but we have a limited drug use. So in most of the studies, a maximal previous drug experience of 10 times was allowed, but that would have included MDMA, amphetamine, and all the psychedelics. So even though some of them were experienced, they couldn't tell the difference. So, no.
Tick. I have a question here over the dosing. You mentioned you used the same dose for all the participants. You didn't normalize it by body weight.
No.
And do you have data on whether the noise would be reduced if you normalize by body weight, for example? Because I was surprised that it's.
So I did an analysis and looked whether body weight would influence plasma concentrations and effects, and it did not.
Oh, okay. And a small question: most graphs are not on the paper. Actually, I saw that you mentioned the paper 2021 from you.
But it's not published yet.
Ah, okay.
I hope it will come out at some point.
Here, thank you. How do you define bad drug effect, good drug effect? What is it?
So that's very unspecific, actually. So it's just on that visual analog scale, there's a question, is it good what you feel? Is it bad what you feel? So we don't really distinguish, so it's just, it can be everything. But interestingly, maybe I can share a little anecdote here. We had a participant once, and I think she was on a high dose of LSD, and she was really, really sick the whole day. It's like she had to run to the toilet like every half an hour. But on the visual analog scale, she did not put any bad drug effect because she did not care in that moment that she was sick.
I have a question about here. You did this study with SSRI and psilocybin. Did you do the same with MDMA and LSD or others?
No, I think there has been a study conducted in the early 2000s with MDMA by Matthias Liechti, and I think it dampened the effect of MDMA a lot. When you combine it with an SSRI, you almost have no effect left. And for LSD, it has not been conducted yet.
Hello. Here. I had a question about the duration of the experience when you go from 100 to 200 micrograms of LSD. I'm just trying to, the charts went by so quickly. So from what I understand, it seemed like everything was kind of, the graphs were kind of dipping at an 8-hour point for about 100 micrograms, is that right? And then they were dipping at a 12-hour point for 200?
Approximately.
Is that about right?
Yes. So we have approximately 10 hours for 100 microgram and approximately 12 hours for 200 micrograms. But I mean, that's just the mean. We have some people that still feel effects after 16 hours for the 200 micrograms. And we have participants which do not feel an effect anymore after 7 to 8 hours. So.
But you definitely saw a difference between 100 and 200
Yes.
in terms of duration of effect. That made, and with psilocybin, was that the same thing? When you went from 15 to 30, was there a difference in duration of effect or not as
There is
pronounced?
a difference. I have not yet calculated it completely properly, but I see an effect in durations, yes. And I think, but it's not that much a difference between 30 milligrams of psilocybin and 100 microgram of LSD. However, I have to calculate it again. So,
Thank you very much.
I have a question. As a participant in your study, I experienced quite a strong cardiovascular and cardiorespiratory stimulation during the high doses of psilocybin and LSD. I had the experience that I was hyperventilating for hours. And when now looking at the figures, the cardiorespiratory response was not so much compared to mine, I had the feeling. So could it be that there's a subgrouping effect, that some subjects have quite high responses and some the normal responses you show? Did you do a subgroup analysis, for example?
No, because I would not know how to define these subgroups. Because it also depends on what is going on in the moment, and because we use a within subject design, sometimes even maybe it has also an order effect. I mean, after you received your fourth dose, maybe you're not as agitated anymore as when you receive your first dosing. So I would not know how to define this, but I can say that it's a big range. So some people react more than others do.
Hello, here. Do you do personality test to the people before the treatment?
Yes, we do. We use all the normally used personality tests. But however, to find results there, you need a large sample. So if you only use 30 participants, you will not see any effect on this. So this will be a larger pooled analysis that I think will be conducted in the next few years, because we have a large sample now, but it has not been analyzed yet.
Yeah, but because I thought that doing the personality test would help to weight the result of the final judgment on the experience, like if someone is strongly fearful or similar. I mean, I don't know, like personality habits to react in a certain way to kind of clean the results and being a bit more objective.
But there has only been, to my knowledge, there has only been one analysis done by Erich Studerus, who looked at this. And I mean, one analysis is not a lot. So that's why we first try to conduct it with a larger sample. And after that, maybe you can take a look at the results again and see if
Thank you.
Phone, please.
Yeah, here, next. So my question is, how do you define ego dissolution, and what questions did you ask in order to measure this?
So for the visual analog scale ego dissolution, it's just a single item. It's one item we took out of the 5-dimension of altered states of consciousness questionnaire. It says more or less the border between me and my surroundings starts to blur, and that's how we ask them. It's just one item, one visual analog scale. However, on the 5-dimension of altered states of consciousness, it's a defined subset of visual analog scales and items that go into this subscale.
Here, I have a question about the study you did with psilocybin and Escitalopram. Suppose there's a person who you think could profit from psilocybin treatment, but he or she is very anxious. Would you recommend, based on this study, to give him 2 weeks of this stuff?
Yeah, das ist Escitalopram. Yes, that's one solution one could think out of this. I mean, it has not been done yet, so one could try and maybe see what the results are.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, so I have a very general question. I've read conflicting information about this, so I'm interested to what you have to say. what can you tell me about MDMA neurotoxicity in general? Is that something to be concerned about?
So I think it's concerned about if you use very, very regularly MDMA. And I mean, with regularly, there are cases of people that are addicted because MDMA is also an amphetamine, and they use it on a daily to weekly basis on really high doses. But I think if you use it in a therapeutic setting, that's not something to be concerned about.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the lecture. And it was a question related to intensity in the score of eco dissolution, because I think from all the scores, it could be maybe the more subjective one. And depending in an altered state, have a score on that can be very subjective. So from your perspective, how can you assess actually that?
So yes, of course it's subjective, and that's why we call them subjective effects. It's what they feel in the moment during the trip. However, I know that working with these visual analog scales, especially on the high doses, is sometimes conflicting, because sometimes they don't even know what a sheet anymore is or what these words mean. So we try to do our best here, but yeah, not always that easy.
Thank you.
I'm over here again. It's another question about psilocybin. I think most citizens who have the experience of psilocybin are picking mushrooms, Panaeolus semilanceata. And the beautiful thing is that you can then dose precisely mushroom by mushroom. Do you have any idea of just about how many individual mushrooms correspond to the doses of the pure substance? It's a serious question.
I know, and I've thought about these questions a lot, and I even went to research it a little bit, but I really, honestly, I don't know. Sorry.
I wanted to ask a question. Did you find some correlation between the physical effects and the subjective effects? For example, with good or bad experience, or with some specific type of experience?
I have not calculated that yet for the psilocybin LSD comparison, and also not for the LSD amphetamine MDMA comparison study, but in the LSD dose response, as far as I recall, I did not see an effect.
Thank you.
So it's not a question, but I asked myself the same. The same question as Jeremy. So I checked during the speech, and what I found, it was like I think there's 1% of psilocybin per gram of psilocybin-assisted. That will mean that's like a 200 microgram of LSD. It's equal to 3 dry gram of those kind of mushroom.
So I agree.
So that
but from a first pharmaceutical point of view, like the content is not always the same.
For sure, for sure.
So that's why it's
and they're different kind of
mushrooms.
Yeah. But thank you.
Hello. Just one comment. You can go to the drug checking in many big Swiss cities and bring your mushrooms. And I don't know, you have to bring around 1 gram, right?
150 milligrams.
150 milligrams, so even less. And they can give you the average content of psilocybin.
Yes, but for that mushroom?
Well, I think it's average for many mushrooms, 150 milligrams.
No, yes, but I mean, they can give you the content of that exact mushroom, and not for generalizing.
Yeah, but for your batch, for your collection of this day, so it should be.
Yes.
Initially, you mentioned that in the slide of all the previous studies, and ongoing studies, you mentioned that there's a lot of interest in microdosing. Now, I wonder with this, with microdosing, is there so much hope in it, or is it just that it's easier to get a permission to do a microdosing study because there's less psychoactive effects?
I think it's both. First of all, microdosing has not been that well studied, and then it's new, and then of course it's something where we need research on, so people will study this, and also because I think it's easier to get an approval in healthy participants if you don't dose that high, from a safety perspective.
All right, we have time for 2 questions. 2 last questions, there and there. What was the second one? There.
Is there any research with the microdosing MDMA as well?
Not to my knowledge. No. And I don't know whether this would make a lot of sense, just given the mechanism of action, because you need a certain threshold dose, I think, to release the serotonin into the synaptic cleft. And I don't know if it would do this with microdosing. Yes. And we also see that for the lower doses of MDMA, there can be, or there has been seen that there can be sometimes be paradoxical effects, so that when it's too low, that people don't feel so comfortable.
Too low, what do you mean?
Too low, so when you're around, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 milligrams, it's maybe not high enough to get the real entactogenic effects, but more more paradoxical effects, that it's somewhere in between, and it's not really comfortable.
Here. Thank you for your presentation. And I was wondering if there are studies done with elderly people, and if you think we should adapt the dose for the elderly.
So in our studies, we include people from 25 up to 65 years. And I don't know how old the oldest was. I think we were somewhere around 60. And I don't think the effect was much different, but I do not know at this time about studies in elderly people. And I also think it's a very vulnerable, or not vulnerable, but it's not a group that is so easy to find and to conduct phase 1 studies in. Three ladies. So
all right, so we're done for this first talk. Thank you so much, Friederike.